Hello and welcome into the KE Report. I'm your host, Shad Markwitz, and today we're getting an update from Emerita Resources. Emerita is traded on the TSX.V under the ticker EMO and on the OTCQB under the ticker EMOTF. And I'm joined today with the CEO and Chairman of Emerita Resources, David Gower. And David, great to get you on the show, as always, to get an update on Emerita. A lot going on with the company at multiple projects here. We're going to dig in first to the IBW project, the Iberian West Project. This is in Spain along the Iberian Pyrite Belt. This area of the project has really three deposits. You've got La Romanera, La Infanta, and El Cura. And you've done a lot of work in the past at La Romanera and La Infanta, and you're getting geared up for a resource to come out by the end of this quarter. But El Cura is the area really in between those two that we just mentioned that's getting the lion's share of the work right now because you're trying to fill in the knowledge on that, do more drilling. You actually just had results that came out to the market today on the 13th, and you talk in there about 9.3 meters, grading 1.1% copper, 1.2 grams per ton gold. But there's actually a lot of metals in here. We've talked about this before. You've got lead, you've got zinc, you got silver, along with the copper and the gold. There's actually a number of holes you released in here. Maybe give us a high level take on the work going on to further define resources at El Cura.
Yeah, sure. So the reason we started drilling El Cura last was because we had historical drilling on both Infanta and Romanera. We had about 50 historical drill holes on both of those. So they were much easier to plan the initial program. Whereas El Cura, we knew it was there from references in the archives, but we didn't have any of the old drill holes. So we kind of had to find it again. And as it turns out, it's about midway between Infanta and La Romanera. So it's actually quite an interesting location because the development that we're conceptualizing right now would see a ramp for La Romanera that will basically pass right by where El Cura is. So it has the potential then to actually give us access to earlier ore and much earlier cash flow in terms of the potential development of the project. So it's quite critical. And the other thing about it is it is a more copper gold rich than the other deposits, certainly more so. Well, it's similar, I guess, in gold to parts of La Romanera, but generally it's more copper rich and lower in zinc lead base metals, which copper obviously as a commodity is worth more per ton than zinc and lead at this point by a multiple. So it does make it a valuable ore. And the preliminary metallurgical results that we have indicate that the metallurgy should be very good, at least for the base metals. We don't have the precious metals metallurgy on El Cura yet, but we will have it on time to complete a resource estimate by the end of the quarter.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the met work. We did get into that in our last discussion, but just for people that missed that, David, like you say, there's a slight difference in the mineralization between Romanera and looking at La Infanta, and El Cura is kind of in that same boat in that it's got the higher precious metals content. You're going to be producing multiple concentrates, but just walk us through what you've already learned from some of the other metallurgical test work you've done.
Yes, we'll have very good recoveries of base metals. We'll be able to produce 3 saleable concentrates of base metals. La Romanera is unique in this belt in that it has this portion of it that's very gold rich. And if you look at our 2023 resource estimate, because we didn't have metallurgy at that time, we were only credited for 20% gold recovery. And we have now done the work and we have a path identified through careful metallurgical testing where we'll get 65% of the gold at La Romanera. We don't know. I think so far El Cura has been simpler from a base metal perspective in terms of metallurgy. We don't know how that will play out for the gold and the silver yet, but at the very least, we can use the same process that we've developed for La Romanera. So a minimum 65% recovery should be expected. So given the value of gold these days, a gram is worth somewhere over $90. So if you've got a couple of grams per ton, that's going to more than pay for all of the other metals, basically. So it has a massive benefit for the project to have worked hard to achieve those results.
Yeah, today's gold prices, it's definitely a nice co-credit that, like you say, helps carry the base metals. And I think getting 65% is a lot better than 20%, David. So even if you
Yeah.
can improve it from there, it gives you just some upside in the project. Now, this is all building towards, as we mentioned, a resource coming out the end of this quarter. As far as the drilling that you're doing, you mentioned to me off mic that you've already kind of put a pin in La Romanera and La Infanta, but you're still doing a little more drilling on El Cura through next week just to try to get that in. Maybe talk to us about what's going to make it through the cutoff and then when you can expect the resource coming out.
Yeah, so the work has already started. It'll be Wardle Armstrong out of the UK that will do the MRE. They did the last one as well, and they do a lot of the work in this belt for all the operating companies. So those databases are locked. We have some more holes in the lab and a couple that we're finishing up at Alcura that we would like to get into the database. And it's got basically two purposes. Some of the holes are to continue to expand it. Others are to tighten up drilling so that we will have an indicated level of resource calculation under 43101 as opposed to inferred, because we want to move very quickly down the road towards pre-feasibility slash feasibility on the back of this. So it's important for us to have a good drill density and have a solid resource estimate to support that.
Well, and as you move towards the PFS, towards the Q3 area of this year, there's other work you're doing in the background. I know there's other de-risking work. Like you say, we just talked about the metallurgical work, but another big question people have in their minds is the permitting landscape. Can you give us an update in that regard?
Yeah. So we applied for a mining license over a year ago, December, I guess, that we filed the actual documentation. And the project has subsequently been granted this designation that they have in Spain, a designation of strategic importance for the economy. And so we've been on a fast track for permitting as a result, because once you get that designation, the government has basically said this project's important to us as well as you. So they actually assign senior bureaucrats to make sure that it's always at the top of the pile for any decisions. So we do expect to get the environmental authorization for the project in the next few weeks. What that implies, of course, is that we already have done a lot of the engineering that will be used to do the pre-feasibility, and that's why it should move very quickly. All of the surface infrastructure, basic layout for the underground drifts and all of those things are all required as part of the permitting process. Once we have the new MRE, we'll be able to take all of that and then convert it into a 43101. And we're not obviously allowed to disclose any economics or anything like that around the project until we've done that. So that's why all that seems to be in the background. But of course, 43101 is a Canadian regulation, and it has no bearing on work you're doing in most other countries from a permitting perspective. They have their own standards. And so we have to meet those standards as well as 43101, and that's what we've been working towards. So I think that part of the process should be quite straightforward, because essentially when we bring on the QP, the engineering QP, to do the sign off on the project, they'll be basically costing a project that's more or less permitted. So there won't be any trade-off studies. It's already gone through those and it's satisfied the regulators. That's kind of how I would describe the process. We could be in the unusual situation where we have a permit before we actually have a published feasibility, but clearly we've had to do a lot of that work already.
Yeah, David, that's an interesting batting order or sequence of events, just balancing between the work you're doing in Spain for the Spanish regulations versus also the 43101 for the Canadian listing. So you'll actually be ahead of the game there if you get the permit before you have the feasibility study, but that's not a bad thing. That's a wonderful thing for the company. That's usually the hardest part to get, all that environmental work and all the different water studies and air studies. It's, you'll already had a lot of that completed. So it looks like there's a lot going on with IBW here, really just the next couple of weeks and obviously the next couple of months. So we'll keep tabs on it for sure and get you back on when you get the resource out for an update. Let's shift over to another project, a little earlier stage, but that's going to possibly get some exploration work later this year, and that's Noeva Tintillo. You think that there's a chance here for some real discovery stage drilling later in the year because you've already found some gaussins at surface, and you think if you get down underneath the cover and get into the fresh rock, that maybe some discoveries waiting to be made. Give us a snapshot of that for people not familiar with this project.
Yeah, so Nuevo Tintillo is a large property, very well located. It's about 90 kilometers to the east of the IBW project, closer to Aznalcollar and very close actually to the Rio Tinto mine, the famous Rio Tinto, where the company actually was founded in the 1880s. So we've actually discovered, or our teams have discovered, gaussins at surface. And in this belt, there are lots of gaussins that don't lead anywhere. There's a lot of pyrite around, but in this case, these gaussins, we're seeing very good gold values of over a gram with up to 150 grams silver. And that's usually a good sign because gaussins basically are the rusty remnants that are left over when metals at surface essentially rust out naturally. But typically, the base metals will be leached out as part of that process, weathering process, but the gold and silver stay behind. And it would be very unusual that you would have a Gaussian with very good gold and silver in this environment and not see base metals at depth. So just the presence of these higher grades of precious metals is a very good indicator that this is probably, for want of a better word, a pregnant system in terms of overall VMS and base metals. So we're pretty excited, and we will get some drilling on that later in the year. We want to do some geophysics and things like that just to make sure that we can be very efficient when we do start the drilling. But so there's a little bit of groundwork to do to firm this target up. But they've identified these samples over about 400 meters, so it's quite a little extensive zone. And very interestingly, we haven't seen any record of anything in this area in the archives, and that is unusual. Usually the Romans actually found evidence of almost everything in this belt, or if not them, somebody a few centuries after. But this one might actually be completely new. So, and it's almost within sight, just a few kilometers away from the famous Rio Tinto mine. You can see the waste piles from these outcrops.
Well, fingers crossed you have something like the Rio Tinto mine there, but you won't know till you get drilling, but a little more targeting work it sounds like to do with some of the geophysics and groundwork first, but then later in the year, hopefully get some exploration updates there at Nueva Tintillo.
It would actually be very good because we would hopefully have something higher grade than Rio Tinto because it's quite a low grade deposit, but there is a mill there. So anything you find in this area potentially could be developed very quickly because you probably could negotiate a custom milling contract to get started.
Yeah, that's a nice benefit too, not having to build the mill. If you can just truck it to the mill and do an ore agreement, then another arrow in your quiver and helps on not having a huge capex blowout to at least maybe monetize some of that deposit, providing you find something there that makes sense to truck to the mill. So that could be another interesting angle as far as the development of Nueva Tintillo. But first, let's see what you get drilled up, David.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, let's not get the cart before the horse, as they say.
Yes. Well, and then, of course, last but not least, we do need to get an update on Aznalcollar. I think a lot of people listening familiar with the story are probably waiting with bated breath. But for those not familiar, you have a legal proceeding going on where you find out if you're going to get awarded the project. Some of that is going to be a process, but it's pretty far advanced now, and I think it's more of the sentencing phase. Just give us a quick snapshot of what to expect here in the not so distant future.
Yeah, so the actual hearings for the final phase of this odyssey, which I think has gone on for almost 10 years now, starts on March the 3rd. And I think there's about 6 weeks of court time that have been set aside for this. It's obviously going to be a very high profile case in Spain where you've got 16 people charged with corruption, and most of them are government employees. So you can imagine if that was the case here, it would be front page of the Globe and Mail. Here it'd be front page of El Mundo or whatever the national paper is in Spain there. It's a different court system, so it's not a jury trial. There have been 5 Superior Court judges already that have indicated there are no more grounds for appeal and that the crimes have been committed. So it's really, as you point out, a process that culminates with sentencing. And then the reason that's important is this was a public tender, and that the crimes of corruption are related to the wrongful awarding of a public tender. And under Spanish law, and there's a lot of precedents for this, if there's a crime committed in awarding a public tender, that bid must be disqualified. And we were the only other qualified bidder, and it must be awarded to the next qualified bidder. So the process will involve, obviously, the trial. There are two courts, a criminal court, which would deal with the crimes of corruption. And then there's an administrative court that actually deals with the public tender itself and the awarding of it. But once the crime has been confirmed by a conviction, the administrative court will then rule. And they've already done their work. But once the criminal courts indicated no more grounds for appeal, it freed up the administrative court to go through the evidence and make their conclusions. And they did make a statement publicly that they concurred with the findings of the criminal court. So we kind of know where they're at. And according to Spanish counsel, it would be unheard of for an administrative court to contradict the criminal court. So, it's a lower court, basically, in that sense. So I would expect, sometime at the end of this process, 6 weeks or so, the three judges that are hearing the evidence will probably convene and go through all of the statements, et cetera, and then there'll be a process of coming back and sentencing. And following that, then the resolution of the administrative court will follow. And we went through a similar situation with the administrative court when we acquired IBW. That was also a disputed project. And when the administrative court, in that case, there was no criminal lawsuit in that case, it was all administrative. But when they did rule, they gave very specific instructions, including timelines, for the mines department to cancel the previous resolutions and reissue the resolutions. And they spelled out exactly how they should be issued and who to, and what the timelines were. So I think all of this will ultimately wrap up after the summer, but I don't really know the timing. At this point, we just know the timing of the court case, but I assume there would be a period of deliberation after the hearings. And then in August, in this part of Spain, it gets very hot and everything shuts down. So the courts all shut down. So in my mind, I'm thinking we're looking sometime in the third quarter for this to be resolved, but that's just my best guess.
Well, that's all you can do at this point. You don't know the future, but you can at least say that the process is starting here just in early March, so not that far away, just a couple of weeks away. But just for people listening, you're not going to have an answer in early March. It's going to be a process where it's going to take at least until mid-April or May, even on the sentencing, and then the deliberation, and then, like you say, maybe something by the summertime or even in Q3, you'll have a better answer on how to move forward and what the move forward process looks like, what the specific arrangement is. So fingers crossed there that everything works good in favor of Emerita, and it looks like things are lining up in that sense. And as we've discussed in previous interviews, Aznalcollar is a monster of a project, so it'd be a big asset to the company. And I'm sure we'll be talking about it again down the road, David. But I also want to focus just on the financial health of the company. You have a lot of work going on, so sometimes people email in questions like, how are they going to pay for this? I think that it's important to highlight the news that you put out. It was in August of last year with Nebari that you have the loan facility in place with them to advance IBW, but you've also had some good action on the warrants that have brought some money into the kitty. So what is the financial health of the company right now, David?
Yeah, the company's in very good shape. We've only drawn the first tranche of the money that's available from Nebari, and we're not very far through that, in fact. And we've had, since the beginning of the year, given the movement in the share price, we've had very good uptake on the warrants. And so I'm not exactly sure what the latest count is, but they've been coming in fairly steadily weekly. So it's added at least, I'm sure it's over 3 million at least on top of that to what was already in the treasury. And we do expect to see that to continue over the next little while as well. So more than enough to cover the activities that we have planned for this year.
Well, that's a good thing. A lot of companies can't say, and it's nice to see warrants being exercised and in the money. It's always a nice thing for the company, but it's a good thing for shareholders too, because it means that there's good action in the share price, which there has been. So a lot of good ingredients coming together for Emerita Resources. I think we'll wrap it up there for today, David, but let's get you back on when the resource comes out and unpack that together. And then, and if you have some news back on the permitting by that point in time, we can hit that in tandem. So, for people
Sounds
listening
good.
in, if you want to follow the news flow with Emerita, there's going to be a lot of it coming up. Definitely click on the link below this interview. It takes you right over to the company website, straight to their news section, where you can either sign up for updates or just keep following along with the news as it hits the wires. David, always great having you on the show, and looking forward to our next conversation.
Great. Thanks, Chad, and have a great day.